When I was coming in here, why am I here tonight? I'm here tonight because Simon asked me. And that's kind of important. He asked me, because if he hadn't asked me, I wouldn't be here. Now, in truth, he made me, he made me an offer I couldn't understand. He said, if you come here tonight, obviously you have to do it pro bono, which is great because that means we'll save some money this year, and next year we can get a real speaker. So, a real speaker. But it's great. What you're doing, Simon, is fantastic. Really admire what you're doing. It's really wonderful. I was in this college now, obviously, now that's today nor yesterday, a long time ago. And when I went here, Dublin was essentially male, pale, and stale. It was a pretty unadventurous, kind of fairly dull city in many ways, kind of a dreary, not great restaurants. I remember I went into a restaurant back in those days, and I asked the waiter, what's the soup du jour? He said, hang on, I'll ask the chef. So he goes in and he asks the chef, and he comes out and he says, it's soup of the day. Right? That was then. Now, the thing Simon and I have in common is we both spent a big chunk of time in Australia. And Simon's heard me speak before, and I think a couple of people here at Duke haven't heard me speak before. So I'm a little bit nervous about this. And I was thinking, I reminded myself of Professor Max Planck, you might remember, was a great German theoretical physicist, and 100 years ago this week he won the Nobel Prize for Physics, and he went to Oslo to collect his prize, and he went back to Germany, and he decided to tour Germany over 50 nights and give a speech on the latest developments in global physics. And he did it night by night, and he had a driver who used to sit in the back, and fantastic speech. And then one morning at breakfast, the driver said, you know, I've heard you give this speech so often. He said, I think I could give this speech on global physics just as well as you could. So Max Planck had a sense of humor, and he said, you know what, tonight you give the speech, and I'll sit in the back and we'll see how you get on. So the driver gets up in Karlsruhe, and he gives a speech for an hour on the latest development of global physics. Fantastic speech. But then just at the end, somebody put their hand up and said, may I ask you a question, Professor Planck? And the driver said, absolutely. And he asked this very detailed, complex question. And the driver, without missing a beat, said, you know what? He said, the answer to that question is so simple, even my driver could answer it. He's sitting in the back. So the reason I like what you're doing, and a funny way I'm sort of startup myself, is I love the notion that nobody ever started a large company. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak put together a few bits of a computer in a garage and sold the first Apple computer. Jeff Bezos started Amazon in his front room. Walt Disney's first cartoon was in a garage at the back of the house. A shed was where two guys, one called Hewlett and one called Packard, started their business. I think it's just extraordinary. I mean, in fact, in 1985, a plane took off from Waterford with 15 passengers, just about made it over to London, the first ever flight of Ryanair. And they're going to do 120 million passengers this year. Zuckerberg started his company in his dorm in Harvard. Pieta House here in Ireland, the darkness into light walk they do every year, started with a few hundred walkers. There's now several 100,000 do it. Men's Shed is an organisation in Ireland for men to get involved in furniture and do stuff together, build stuff in boats and things. Came from Australia with one men's shed. There's now 400 in Ireland. And I worked for two guys actually, who had an idea to set up an organisation. And the guys, one was called Tony O'Reilly, and we have the O'Reilly Institute down here. And he was a successful Irish businessman. He was involved in newspapers, he was involved in Waterford Crystal, he's involved in the H.J. Heinz Food Company in the United States. He's still around, he lives in France. And he lived in Pittsburgh. And he got together with a guy called Dan Rooney. Dan Rooney was the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers football team. And they had an idea. Dan Rooney was from Newry in Northern Ireland. They had a notion that there was such a thing as an Irish empire. Not built by military might or force of arms, but just by the fact that so many Irish people over the centuries went all around the world. And they said, could we develop a network of Irish people around the world, people connected ancestrally to Ireland, who might engage back with this island and do stuff, particularly because at that stage we had a particularly vicious conflict in Northern Ireland. They weren't sure if it would work, but held a dinner. The black tie fundraising dinner in the Waldorf Astoria in New York, the great and the good. And the dinner was so unsuccessful, the only reason they had a second dinner a year later was to pay for the first dinner they had. And yet that organization went on to raise $600 million. It's called the American Ireland Fund, or called the Ireland Funds generally. And Tony's a funny speaker, if any of you remember him. It was modeled on the UJA, the United Jewish Appeal. What Jewish people around the United States and around the world did to support Israel, could there be a model similarly for Irish people to support Ireland? And the organizations now, it's in 39 cities and 13 countries around the world. I was lucky enough to work for them for 21 years. I was based in Sydney for a chunk, and then 15 years in Boston in Massachusetts. And what they asked me to do at one stage, O'Reilly and Rooney said, we want you to raise $100 million for this organization. You go figure how to do it. So that was where I got into this whole business of asking, really asking in a precise way. I realized that there was 40,000 people going to our events every year, and I and my small little team couldn't go and see the 40,000 people. So we did a thing called rating and screening. We brutally looked at the 40,000. We took 39,000 off the table. We looked at the last 1,000 and we rated them. A, B, C, D, E, F, based on their capacity. What sort of wealth have they? And also on their propensity. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So Bill Gates, for us, had terrific capacity. But he had no interest in us, no propensity, so we took him off the table. But it left us, when we sort of hit our sort button on the computers, with lots of lists of people. And we knew where we had to go. And through and I always felt that fundraising essentially was about 4 phases: research, cultivation, solicitation, and stewardship. So a final example was some weeks later, I went to see one of the great Irish-American figures, a magnificent man, absolutely fantastic guy, and really, really one of the great leaders of American business. And I'd gotten to know him well over the years, so I just went on my own. I went to see him, and I decided to ask him for 10 million. And so I came into his office. He saw me coming in, and he's quite a tactile kind of guy. And he came over, he put his arm around me, and he's kind of giving me a thump. He's kind of a jock kind of thing. And I'm thinking, this is a good start. I'm just about to ask him, to consider a gift of 1 million a year for 10 years, a 10 million gift. When he said, you know what, he said, I love what you're doing with your campaign. We've decided to support you. And I'm thinking, this is like nirvana. This is like heaven in my business. He said, we've decided to give you $10,000. $10,000. I was on the brink of asking this guy for a really enormous amount of money. And you know what? He was brilliant. He knew exactly where I was coming from. He knew exactly my game. And he came in, he cut the legs from under me. And the bizarre thing is when somebody gives you a check for $10,000, you know what you have to say? You have to say, gee, thank you very much. And he was genius. I learned a lot. I learned a lot in that. And I realized we weren't really in his top 5, philanthropic interests. So, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. In all of these things you learn. That was my experience of if you like, closing a deal and your business. But it all comes down to what I said at the very beginning, asking. My experience in the work I was doing is, you can either try being successful by asking for money or not asking for money. I always found I was more successful asking for money. Thanks.